Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality. I'm your host, Doc Bach, here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we are continuing our series on antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial is the countercultural and often criminal personality that can show up in many places. But what sets antisocial apart from psychopathy? Are they the same thing? Some theorists thought so, while others, like Robert Hare, didn't. Let's unpack the controversy and our thoughts. Historically, psychopath or psychopathy meant something totally different than it does today. Psychopath in the late 1800s basically was a question of, does the person's pathology originate in the psyche, or does society make them this way? So if they're born with it, the condition is psychopathic. And then if society makes them, the condition is sociopathic. Now, not too long after that, the term psychopathic then became a catch-all term for personality disorders, meaning that the personality dysfunction originates in the psyche.
And of course, there was a ton of stigma around personality dysfunction, especially the types prone to criminal mischief. We used pejorative terms like moral insanity and constitutionally inferior to describe them.
Yeah, we sure did. Yeah. So to quell this stigma, we then overcorrected and started calling those with personality conditions sociopaths, or those with sociopathy, meaning society made them this way.
And then what followed was essentially a tug of war between calling personality disorders sociopathic or psychopathic, as they were trying to take value-laden labels out of the naming process, and no one could agree.
Until Cleckley came on the scene in 1941 with his famous book, The Mask of Sanity, to try to clear up the trash can term that psychopathic and sociopathic had become. Researchers then appreciated his clarification of psychopathic traits, as well as his assertion that these types are found not only in prisons, but in some of society's most powerful and respected roles.
Politicians, businessmen, entrepreneurs, scientists, doctors.
Yeah, the usual suspects. And he said that the successful types, quote, keep up a far better and more consistent outward appearance of being normal. The chief difference lies perhaps in whether the mask or facade of health is extended into superficial material success.
Hence the book name, Mask of Sanity. Like, how good is the mask?
Bingo. Yep. So Cleckley's groundbreaking work set the stage for Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist in the 1970s, which we'll get more into in a bit. However, there did seem to be a split in that some theorists believe that psychopath was the same thing as the antisocial personality that we know now, while others said the terms are different, with psychopathy being the more severe version, or even more severe than antisocial.
Right. Psychopathic and antisocial personality is like the same in psychodynamic personality literature. There is no antisocial personality, just psychopathic, which antisocial falls under. So the PDM authors noted, we prefer the earlier term psychopathic to the current antisocial. Many people with psychopathic personalities are not obviously antisocial. That is, they're not observably at odds with social norms. In fact, many people with psychopathic personalities are able to pursue their agendas in contexts of social approval and even admiration.
I love that quote. Yeah. Positions of approval or admiration like Wall Street, politics, entrepreneurs, world leaders, the types that are drawn to powerful positions and either are admired for it or hated, or they're polarizing when they're a little of both. So also the DSM doesn't use psychopathic, but it did use a similar term in its first editions. So sociopathic personality disturbance was in the DSM-1, and it later became antisocial personality disorder in the DSM-3.
Then we also have Michael Stone, who's a forensic psychiatrist. And in 2018, he came up with a dark spectrum of personalities that place psychopathy as more severe than antisocial.
Yes, he did. Yeah. And I think we should unpack his work first because I think it's personally the most helpful in understanding the nuances between antisocial and psychopathy.
Absolutely. Let's go.
Okay.
So Stone's spectrum is a range capturing more than just antisocial and psychopathy. His negative spectrum of personality has 6 components, with each level getting progressively worse. So let's start at the beginning. So level 1 is simply negative personality. So those who have severely negative traits like being abrasive, deceitful, tactless, aggressive, cruel, or malicious.
Yeah, you're jerks of the world, what I call the prickly porcupine people. So we like to call this dusk in terms of personality darkness. Like these types probably aren't going to murder you, but they're really, really irritating and they can just make your life miserable.
Sure. And then level 2 is severe personality disorders, including narcissistic and paranoid personality disorders. So narcissistic personality disorder involves a tendency to be self-important, entitled, exploitative, envious, and arrogant with a need for admiration. They believe they're special and fantasize of unlimited success, which sets them up for risky, yucky behaviors. Yeah. And then they can also have decreased, intermittent, or even just a lack of empathy.
Yeah. So your average narcissist won't kill you, unless their personality is mixed with other dark traits, which is yet to come. So stay tuned. They're just killing your self-esteem and your sense of normalcy. They're toxic. Yeah.
Right. And then in the second level, we also have those with paranoid personality disorder. So these types believe without evidence that others are out to get them. They like to read neutral statements and events as demeaning or threatening because they think that others are dangerous. They don't confide in anybody because they fear it will be used against them.
Yeah. And then they unjustifiably doubt the loyalty of others, at times experiencing pathological jealousy as they suspect infidelity of their partner, but again, without evidence. So they hold grudges and are ready to counterattack as they believe that they should attack first or risk being attacked. But the 3 most dangerous criteria that we just listed are the pathological jealousy, the grudge holding, and the vindictiveness.
Which moves us into level 3. So that's malignant narcissism. So malignant narcissism is a core of narcissism, but it adds antisocial behavior, a sadism or aggressive flavor, and then paranoid features. It originated from Kernberg, who identified that core narcissism. But he noted that there was a worse form of narcissism that pulls in those other dangerous traits. So less dangerous forms of narcissism might be the egocentric superstar who's, always right and brilliant and focused on image. She's super annoying and not great to be around, but she's not malignant.
Yeah. So a malignant form of narcissism involves self-focusedness or image maintenance, plus paranoid suspiciousness that others are out to get them, and then aggressiveness or sadism in a desire to harm others, and then actually acting out of those antisocial behaviors, often by breaking the law. So an example maybe is a world leader whose self-focus is nauseating, plus they find their allies threatening and then worry about being destroyed by them. So then they bully others under their leadership and then threaten to harm their people or other countries as a way to win favor and control.
Right. So this has escalated from the annoying narcissistic superstar. The malignant narcissist has other negative pieces that make them especially dark, and they're often drawn to positions of power to bolster their image.
Right on. Yeah. So level 4 is where we finally get to antisocial personality disorder. So antisocial personality disorder means that we have all of the previous characteristics that are mentioned, like malignant narcissism, negative traits, that pop of paranoia. But the core piece of this personality is antisocial. So this means that they disregard the rights of others in society, which can lead to criminal behavior.
Right. And I think it's helpful to understand that malignant narcissists can engage in antisocial behavior, but all antisocial personalities include the self-focused narcissism.
Absolutely. All dysfunctional personalities have that heaping dose of narcissism as the first ingredient. So then we're at level 5, which is psychopathy. Now, importantly, this is worse than antisocial per Stone's research.
So within psychopathy, Stone differentiates nonviolent and violent psychopathy. So nonviolent psychopathy may overlap with the passive parasitic psychopath, or basically like a con artist who preys on others without empathy in pursuit of his own self-interest.
Yeah, so parasitic, think parasite, the types that just leech off of others but aren't overtly aggressive, but they will con you out of money or find ways to satisfy their greed without murdering you.
Yes, and then we have psychopathy with violence, which may overlap with the aggressive psychopath being more impulsive, aggressive, and assaultive, aka more susceptible to being, violent.
Right, yeah, but we're still not at the worst of the worst yet. Level 6 is the worst of the worst, and that is sadistic personality.
Right. So sadism is not akin to sexual sadism. It's a trait and it can be a core personality. So sadistic personalities achieve dominance through cruelty. They humiliate others. They take pleasure in others' suffering. They lie to harm others. And they might intimidate others to get them to obey. They're excessively controlling, and they may be fascinated by violence, weapons, martial arts, injury, or torture.
No, thank you. Yeah, for these types, harm to others is the name of their game. Anything else, be it power, ego cookies, the like, is just an added bonus because they thrive on harming others.
Yes. And then within this level, Stone notes sadism with terrorism is the worst on his continuum only because the number of victims and deaths are often higher.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So a sadist is going to have psychopathic features. Malignant narcissism, antisocial traits, and elements of paranoia. And they all can go hand in hand, but it's what is at the personality core that makes all the difference. So I also want to say, if you found Stone's spectrum interesting and are looking for more, I recommend episode 27, What's Worse Than a Narcissist? The Baddest of Them All. We get into the details there, so I will link that in the show notes and on YouTube if dark personalities are your jam.
Yes. And then one more note about sadistic or sadism.
Yeah.
Millon notes that sadistic is a separate personality construct from antisocial. The PDM and psychodynamic literature also has sadistic personalities listed as separate from psychopathic. And remember, psychopathic and antisocial are one and the same in psychodynamic.
Right.
And then the DSM actually used to have a sadistic personality in the appendix of the DSM-3 revised, but it was dropped in the DSM-4.
Of course it was. Yeah, we don't talk about that stuff. Nope. We don't talk about personalities that dark in the DSM. So we just stop at antisocial personality on the spectrum. But I do want to move to Robert Hare's work because he is a household name now with the concept of psychopathy. So let's go there.
Okay.
All right. So as we mentioned earlier, Hare used Cleckley's work and created the Hare Psychopathy checklist in the 1970s, and it has since been revised. So for short, it's now called the PCLR.
So the PCLR consists of 20 items, and it's utilized as a semi-structured interview. And then you have to have a score of at least 30 out of 40 to meet the cutoff for psychopathy. Throughout the research, there used to be about two things that the questions essentially were looking for: emotional detachment and antisocial behaviors. Detachment was more associated with narcissism, so exploring things like charm and egocentricity, and then antisocial behaviors were associated with antisocial personality, exploring things like impulsivity, irresponsibility, and a need for stimulation.
Yeah. And then updated research expanded this to include 4 main things that the test explores. That's going to be lifestyle, emotions or affect, interpersonal relations, and then antisocial behavior. So it took a lot of the previous concepts that fit under narcissism and antisocial and then expanded them. And it also included more overt behavioral issues starting in youth. So Doc Fish, with this in mind, how does Hare's psychopathy checklist compare to the DSM's antisocial personality?
In looking at this measure, I think there's some obvious overlap in how each focuses on irresponsibility, impulsiveness, deceptiveness, and lack of remorse. Both also kind of mention aggressive behaviors in different ways, but the only DSM criteria that's not overtly captured by the PCLR are the ones involving breaking the law and reckless disregard for safety of others. However, Hare's checklist does reference offenses, though it's unclear if it has to be criminal offensive or not. I also feel like reckless disregard for safety could be inferred, but it's not overtly captured by the PCLR.
Yeah, so it's safe to say that the DSM's antisocial personality overlaps with Hare's psychopathy checklist.
Yeah, I think a large chunk of the DSM's antisocial personality does map onto the checklist, but not all of it.
Yeah.
So I keep coming back to this research that noted the majority of prisoners, so 70 to 80%, meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder, while only 15 to 25% meet the appropriate score for psychopathy.
Mm-hmm.
So 70 to 80% of prisoners cannot all have the same personality. Just can't.
No, it doesn't work that way. So the psychopathy checklist and the DSM antisocial, it's not a perfect one-to-one match, but of the DSM personality diagnoses, antisocial would be the most obvious pick for Hare's psychopathy, but again, not a 100% match.
Right.
Yeah. And I also personally think that both the DSM and Hare's checklist are perhaps too simplistic in really understanding these darker types, because there can be layers and layers of other personality features that lead to antisocial behavior or psychopathic behavior even. And it's really, really hard to capture that in categorical boxes like the DSM and certainly in a 20 question checklist as well.
I do agree. And on that note, there is research that found the PCLR items are correlated with narcissistic personality disorder, especially the factors involving lifestyle and affect like charm, grandiosity, manipulation, and lack of empathy.
Yeah, not surprised there. Yeah. If we think about it using Stone's continuum that we just talked about, narcissism is inherently present in the following worse things like malignant narcissism, antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, sadism. Yeah.
And then Stone states, if there is, from the standpoint of personality, one red thread running through the majority of violent crimes, this would be narcissism.
There it is.
Makes sense. So those who choose to exploit or destroy others are obviously putting their own desires first, with no consideration of others. And I think that the narcissistic self-focus is most often not violent, but it absolutely can be.
It absolutely can be. Yeah. And I sound like a broken record saying this, but narcissism as a trait is the first ingredient in any major problematic personality. It is the flour in the dysfunctional personality cookie. You have to have it. And then you add in other ingredients and it can make for a quite vile and sometimes even deadly recipe. But we also need to talk about Millon here because he had yet a different take on psychopathy versus antisocial.
Yes, Millon. Okay. So he had a different theory in that he believes psychopathy can show up in various personalities and combinations. So he actually came up with 10 subtypes of psychopathy. And unfortunately, we don't have time to get into all of them today as far as the specifics go, but it is important to understand that Millon believes psychopaths can come in all different kinds and shapes and sizes, depending on what other personality traits are in their psyche.
Yeah, so this is the speed version of all these things. But so my understanding is that Hare's checklist detects the psychopaths, but it doesn't get into the specifics. Kind of like, let's say you're buying a package of gummy worms, right? It's packaged as gummy worms, but you could have like so many different flavors in that package. And the same is true with psychopaths. Like they come in so many different flavors inside that psychopathic package. But I think this is where Millon's theory is very helpful because he actually starts naming the flavors and the flavor combinations. And in those flavor combinations, we actually see a lot of overlap with Stone's work on the dark personality spectrum. So you better believe those 6 dark flavors definitely show up here in Millon subtypes.
Right. So the 10 subtypes have some more of those dangerous personality pieces like antisocial and sadistic and narcissistic and paranoid and negativistic. Others involve histrionic and borderline features and even avoidant and dependent flavors.
I believe that we are going to have a lot of cluster B personality overlap here because that's where antisocial sits. That's where narcissism sits as well. And the more dramatic and erratic types, but also some fearful types also show up in these subtypes, some of the more backward types, even dependent personality. I'm intrigued. So tell me more about these psychopathic gummy worm flavors.
Yeah.
Some sound sneaky.
Well, I do think there's like a couple weird ones that I wouldn't really think about because they're not the classic psychopath.
Yeah.
So some of those weirder ones include the spineless psychopath. So that's the blend of avoidant and dependent features. They're super insecure and feel weak. So then they harm other people as a counter move. Then there's the unprincipled psychopath, who's a narcissistic personality. They're arrogant, fraudulent, and exploitative.
Okay.
And then a disingenuous psychopath is a histrionic personality who's essentially impulsive, resentful, deceptive, all kind of wrapped up in a friendly, sociable exterior.
Oh, my word. That sounds particularly dangerous and yucky. Like a real femme fatale is what I'm thinking. Like, I feel like I've seen some lady boss documentaries that kind of depicted this psychopathic, histrionic type.
Possibly. Okay. I do think the disingenuous psychopaths are fascinating and likely to be misdiagnosed, especially if they're a female.
Right.
So maybe with things like bipolar, depression with psychosis, and schizophrenia, they often do end up in jail. And then they have like gradual disintegration. And an interesting note about this one is that their deceit extends to themselves.
Oh.
Yeah. So they unconsciously want to be loved, but then they feel like the only way they can obtain that is by making other people do it.
Oh, that is so fascinating. So these types lie to themselves, is what you're saying. And they believe their own lies. Hello, self-awareness. Anybody home? So then they manipulate others in order to be loved. I'm thinking this is where some of that dependency comes in, where it's love me, pay attention to me.
And then there's a combination of histrionic and antisocial personalities in the risk-taking psychopath. So they flagrantly disregard danger and pursue thrill at the expense of others, being irresponsible and neglectful. Then there's more of a pure antisocial personality in the covetous psychopath, who essentially feels like life ripped them off. And so they just revengefully take from others to make up for it.
This sounds like your typical flavors, like nothing too surprising here. And then that histrionic flavor means that there's maybe more energy behind this personality.
Exactly. And then the other 5 subtypes are combinations of negativistic, paranoid, and sadistic. So these are particularly dark. The malignant psychopath is a paranoid personality who's resentful, mistrustful, envious, and vindictive. They think others are just out to get them, and they have vengeful fantasies that can be acted out.
Jeez.
However, the abrasive psychopath is a combination of negativistic and paranoid personalities. They're obnoxious and antagonistic, so they spew venom without remorse.
Wow.
Then there's the explosive psychopath. So that's a sadistic personality at the borderline level who have unpredictable, vindictive, rageful outbursts with or without provocation, although they're super sensitive to feelings of betrayal.
Holy smokes. Okay, so the explosive psychopath with the sadistic core sounds like someone who would go on a killing spree after being slighted. And I'm hearing that instability in this type, which is probably where they overlap with borderline, with the instability. Yeah.
Yes, but they get worse.
They always do.
Right? Millon lists the last two as particularly frightening and cruel. So the malevolent psychopath is a mixture of paranoid and sadistic personalities, being hostile, vindictive, and destructive, as well as having a cold-blooded ruthlessness to find revenge for their childhood mistreatments. So they're also suspicious of others, anticipating betrayal. And Millon quotes, "Many murderers and serial killers fit this."
Oh, joy.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, they also cognitively can understand guilt and remorse, but they don't necessarily feel it.
All right. So here's where it is. Yeah. We have a vendetta against childhood attachments, and then the world has to pay.
Exactly. Which is a combination of negativistic and sadistic personalities and is one of the most pure forms of the classical psychopath.
Okay.
So they're abusive, calculating, and are inspired to attack more when met with resistance or weakness. They go out of their way to be inhumane and unmerciful.
Oh, geez. This reminds me of some true crime stuff that I've heard with the real sickos of the world. Like, I think you've described the quintessential psychopath here. Yeah. But the point in bringing all these up, even if briefly, is to highlight the myriad of ways that a psychopath can present. Like, they are not the same at all. So many different flavor combinations mixed with other personality types. But is antisocial the same as a psychopath? What do you think?
I don't think so. So when I think of psychopathy, I actually think more of sadistic personality, which technically includes paranoid personalities because paranoids have a sadomasochistic dynamic.
Yeah.
So to me, the lay term psychopathy equates to intentional and pleasurable cruelty, which is, of course, the definition of sadism. However, there are other personalities that are more likely to be cruel in more passive or even unintentional ways. So I think about these types of having such high self-interest that they kind of have like blinders on, coveting resources, forcing love that's not real, pursuing risk, etc. So I don't necessarily view antisocial personalities as cruel. They can be, but often not. I definitely view psychopaths as cruel. So I like Stone's continuum best to understand that.
Yeah. So in my world, I would use Hare's checklist to detect the psychopath. So would anyone like to take a test for me, right?
Yeah.
In a perfect world to figure out, okay, do you kind of pass the psychopathic smell test? And though your gut could also probably tell you that. But anyway, and then use Millon's work to narrow down the exact type. And then I think Stone's research is just helpful overall for the conceptualization of how to understand like how dark the psyche can go with his spectrum of negative personalities. But knowing these types also helps us with differential diagnosing. Not that any of these types are necessarily going to end up in our office, but maybe they will in outpatient. But still, because we have all of these dark traits that can overlap, I think it's really helpful to know what's worse and what the different flavor combinations can be. That's where Millon's work comes in. That's where his subtypes pick up on that. The darker traits, in addition to psychopathy. And then, of course, there's a worse prognosis for those types.
Right. Because we're at the end of the line in terms of darkness in the psyche.
Yeah. It doesn't get much darker than that. If we want to go categorical, like names, there's no bottom to how dark the psyche can go. Anyway, in regard to the DSM, I personally wouldn't even use the DSM here because it's really incomplete in its description. Many of Millon's psychopathic subtypes would technically fit under the umbrella term of antisocial in the DSM. And that's not a fit, right? It's just not descriptive enough. And there's way, way more going on in the personality and in the psyche than the trash can diagnosis that antisocial is now.
Exactly. The DSM just stops at antisocial personality disorder and ignores the rest of the dark personalities, and they can't all just be lumped together at the end in antisocial.
Right, which is why we chucked out the DSM. We threw it out the window. Bye, DSM.
Bye.
Anyway, bringing this back around. So today we answered the question of what is antisocial versus psychopathy? Are they the same? Are they different? We presented some evidence here. So I'm curious, listeners and viewers, what do you think? Are they the same? Are they different? I'll put a poll out on YouTube where you can submit your answers. Really curious what you think on this one. We do have Antisocial versus Narcissism coming out next, so don't forget to like, subscribe. If you're a personality nerd, we've also got blogs, visuals, and references that coincide with each episode at www.personalitycouch.com. And if you're a provider looking to consult about a case, or if you're in need of psychodynamic therapy or a deep dive psychological evaluation, we can help with that. I'll provide a link in the show notes below. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.